The Seventh Seal is a 1957 drama film written and directed by Ingmar Bergman. Antonius Block, a knight of the Crusades, and his squire, Jans, return to Sweden after 10 years at war. On the shore, Antonius encounters the personification of death. Antonius, not willing to die, challenges death to a game of chess. Should he win, he will go free. The game is played over the course of a few days, though, not all at once by the shore. Antonius and his squire meet a troupe of performers who are trying to make a living during this difficult time in European history. The Black Plague has ravaged the land and infected a large portion of the population. Antonius is deceived by Death, accidentally giving away his strategy in the game. Death announces that it is checkmate in one move. Antonius and his friends make their way to a castle, home to Mia, his lost love. Death arrives shortly thereafter to collect them all. An actor who believes he receives visions sees Death and his companions in the distance. Antonius has lost the game, and Death has claimed them all. The movements of the chessboard and the meanings of their respective strategies has long confounded analysts. Let's look at the game of chess played by Antonius and Death, both literally and figuratively. First, literally. The game makes no sense. The setting of the Seventh Seal is the 14th century. The rules of chess were actually noticeably different at that time. The game has slowly changed throughout the centuries, making some of what happens during the chess match in the film nonsensical and anachronistic. In one scene, while in confession, Antonius confesses to a man of the cloth, who actually turns out to be Death in disguise, that he is using a knight and bishop attack on his opponent. This would be harder to pull off, not to mention less imposing, in a 14th century chess game. At the time, the bishop was limited to 2 square movements. Presently, the bishop can move diagonally as many squares as the player chooses, but not in the 14th century. Next, Death revels in the fact that he has taken Antonius's queen, but the queen's movements were limited then as well. Further, when Antonius instantly goes first because he has the white pieces, this is a scene out of time as well. White always going first is an invention of the 19th century, not 14th.
Spelar jag dig matt, förger du mig. Du fick svart.
Det passar ju bäst så, inte sant?
Not to mention the continuity of the board is lacking as we see it over the course of the film. There are even more oddities in the way the game is presented, but to sum up, the game makes no sense and was likely a result of a lack of understanding of the rules of 14th century chess, and a disinterest in keeping the board in perfect continuity during the passage of time in the film. Figuratively, the movements of the chessboard are simply the events of Antonius's life. The game begins with an arrangement with Death, as true life begins. We enter the world, the pieces are all there, full of endless possibility, but we are playing against an inevitability. Death will win. Death will always win even if we are clever, and are able to outwit him longer than most. He cheats. In the film, Death impersonates someone and tricks Antonius into giving away his strategy. Death can't lose. The game is meaningless.
Du är rädd.
Jag har glömt hur pjäserna stod.
Men jag har inte glömt. Så lätt ska du inte slippa undan.
Antonius says he is using the knight and bishop. This is in reference to himself and God. Knight, Antonius, a knight of the Crusades. Bishop, a servant of God. Throughout the film, Antonius prays and asks for God to help him, to reveal himself, to prove he exists, and that there is something after this life. That heaven is real and not only a fantasy. He is enlisting God's help in life just as he, the knight, is enlisting God's help, the bishop, in chess. So, what is the significance of Death saying that he has taken Antonius's queen? Much of Antonius's journey is to go home to a castle and see Mia, the woman he loves. Antonius hopes and prays that she is still alive after all this time. In the end, she is alive, but Death takes both Antonius and Mia. When Death says he has taken Antonius's queen in chess, he also means that he will take Mia. Chess players say that the game in the Seventh Seal makes no literal sense, but that's because Bergman was not concerned with the flow of the game, so much as what each move truly meant on a deeper level. The Seventh Seal, in simplest terms, is about doubt. Our doubts about God, the afterlife, humanity, and our long-term survival. The characters represent different stages in man's doubt about the supernatural world, acceptance of the natural world, and fear of losing that world. Joff, an actor and acrobat, staunchly believes in the supernatural world. He strongly believes in God and life after death. Early in the film, he sees a woman helping a baby learn to walk. Instantly, he believes this is the Virgin Mary. There is no practical reason to believe this, but it is what he thinks he sees. When he closes his eyes to rub them, she is no longer there, prompting Joff to assume that she disappeared rather than simply walked out of his view.
Tänk vad du kan hitta på.
Jag märker nog att du inte tror mig. Men det var verklighet, säger jag dig. Inte en sån verklighet som du ser, utan en annan sorts verklighet.
Of course, Joff's ability to see supernatural events can be called into question, but evidence suggesting that he truly can see things begins to mount when he notices Death playing chess with Antonius. We know this is happening. It's the central story of the film. He sees it, but his companions only see Antonius by himself. Supernatural events happening in this film, that is, in many respects, the rejection of the supernatural, may seem contradictory. However, the film is not telling us that the supernatural world exists, only that death exists. Not a physical personification, rather death in the real sense. Antonius represents doubt, but not rejection. Antonius desires the existence of God and the afterlife. He does not want his existence to simply turn to nothingness. He wants more, but his desire is not enough to make his reality manifest. So he wants answers. He seeks them, but he receives nothing. Not from the church, not from the personification of death, not at all. His feelings about God become clear in this scene.
De flesta människor reflekterar varken över döden eller in det.
Men en dag står du ju ändå på livets yttersta näs och ser mot mörkret.
Ja, den dagen.
Jag förstår vad du menar. Vi måste göra oss ett beläte av vår rädsla. Och det belätet ska vi kalla för Gud.
In spite of Antonius's doubts about God, he still hopes that there is something more, and seeks answers throughout the film. Next, we have Jans, the squire. He has already accepted that there is no God and that there is no heaven, yet he is not a dour individual. He's rough around the edges and behaves rudely, but he is not sullen and depressed in the way that Antonius is. Rather, in his acceptance, he has found a liveliness for himself. He writes lyrics, sings songs, and enjoys the company of others. In this, the film tells us that acceptance of the natural world is not a negative. Of the characters and their purposes, the director has said, quote, "Since at this time I was still very much in a quandary over religious faith, I placed my two opposing beliefs side by side, allowing each to state its case in its own way. In this manner, a virtual ceasefire could exist between my childhood piety and my newfound harsh rationalism." Unquote. And Death? What about his character? He, or it, is just a force of nature. In fact, when Antonius asks Death for answers about the afterlife, Death claims that even he doesn't know.
Och du uppenbarar dina hemligheter.
Jag bär inte på några hemligheter.
Så du vet ingenting.
Jag är ovetande.
A note about Death in this film. We don't see Death appear when someone is murdered in a duel or succumbs to illness. Death simply appears. Antonius, in the beginning of the film, has made it home from the Crusades. He has returned to Sweden. Death comes for him suddenly. That begs the question, how did Antonius die? Was it from a wound from war? He seems in perfect health throughout the rest of the film. Death also appears to cut down the tree of a man who only pretended to die to avoid a fight. In this film, the Grim Reaper is not the collector of souls, but actually seems to be the cause of death. He shows up at the end of the film to take everyone with him, but there are no signs that anyone there is actually dying. He kills them. Death kills them. If this is true, what is the film saying about death? Not Death the character, Death the circumstance. Maybe that it is random, that it comes when we least suspect it. Antonius's game of chess with Death occurs because the knight recognizes the Grim Reaper from artwork depicting such games. That's actually true, though in modern times we are more familiar with the idea of Death playing chess due to the Seventh Seal itself. Art related to this dates back to medieval times. Art as a way of expressing thoughts about death is called memento mori, or reminders of death. Death has appeared in art for centuries. One of the first appearances of the symbol of death playing chess in art can be traced back to Albertus Pictor's 15th century medieval painting, Death Playing Chess. The film references Pictor's Dance of Death painting, and then shows it made real at the end of the film. Death says, "No one escapes me," and that's true, all men die. The Dance of Death at the end of the film is not meant to be somber so much as it is a form of acceptance. In a way, death is not unfair. It is the perfect fairness. everyone is the same in death. The personification of death leads a group to their doom, but he is only the messenger, a force of nature.
De är där allihop. Smeden och Lisa. Och riddaren Raval. Och Jöns och Skat. Och den stränga herren döden bjuder dem till dans. Han vill att de ska hålla varandra i händerna. Och så ska de tråda dansen i en långa rad. Och först går den stränga herren med lia och timglas. Men Skat, han slinker på sladden med sitt stränga spel. De träder bortåt. Bort från gryningen i en högtidlig dans. Bort mot de mörka landen.
The title of the film is a reference to a biblical quote in the book of Revelation, chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. There are 2 things of note here. First, silence. In this film, the topic of silence comes up many times, all related to how God has fallen silent. Antonius claims that he hollers in the night, waiting for God to return his cries with a voice, an answer, evidence that he exists, or some kind of comfort. Antonius hears nothing. He hears silence, and not just for half an hour. Infinite silence. Second, although it is not expressly said in the film, only a few verses prior to that part of Revelation, another seal is opened, bringing about one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, death. Although Bergman's version of death is the Grim Reaper and not the Pale Horseman, the connection is clear.
Vem är du?
Jag är döden.
Kommer du för att hämta mig?
Jag har redan länge gått vid din sida.
Det vet jag.
Är du beredd?
Min kropp är rädd. Inte jag själv.
It should be noted that although Bergman claimed his film contains his own internal battle between harsh rationalism and the comfort of faith, the seventh seal rarely shows organized religion in a positive light. The deck is stacked. The battle seems rather one-sided. When Antonius visits a church and wishes to speak to a priest, it turns out to be death in disguise. When the actors are putting on a show, they are interrupted by people carrying crucifixes, hitting themselves to atone for sins, as was the custom at the time, and generally making a terrible and depressing spectacle of themselves. Later, Antonius and Jans encounter a young woman who is about to be burned as a witch. She is obviously not a witch, but the men of faith seem intent on burning someone that day and go through with it. Antonius watches, in horror. Fellow Swedish filmmaker Bo Widerberg had disparaging words about Bergman, claiming that the director of The Seventh Seal spent too much time looking upward and not enough looking sideways. Widerberg's meaning was that his own films were about social issues of the day, whereas many of Bergman's films were about spiritual matters and the existence or non-existence of God. But are the two so completely separate from one another? Belief in God or disbelief in God can sometimes influence a person's views on social issues, terrestrial matters, not heaven, real problems. Belief in God, for example, sometimes sparks opposition to capital punishment, citing the 10 Commandments. Disbelief in God, for example, can command the same feelings, due to an understanding that once we are gone, we are truly gone, and that life should not be taken. This is only one example, there are countless others. So, Bergman's concern with the existence of God and an afterlife is not divorced from practical social issues because sometimes one informs the other, for better or worse. It may be useful to understand the origins of the film. The nucleus of The Seventh Seal came from Bergman's one-act play, Wood Painting, starring some of the same characters from the film, but still quite different. It was more of a comedy. The second artistic influence on his work comes from Carmina Burana, a collection of poems and dramatic texts from the 11th or 12th century. Bergman was inspired by the thought of wandering minstrels who would join beggars traveling around Europe, writing songs which were later sung in churches and festivals. He loved the idea of keeping art alive in dark times. The first version of the film's title was The Night and Death, a simple one, which is closer to the titles of medieval stories, even ones that depict a similar idea, a man's encounter with death or the devil, such as Johannes von Tempel's The Plowman and Death, or Albrecht Dürer's engraving Night, Death, and the Devil. It was changed in later drafts. In an early press release for The Seventh Seal, Bergman described his work as an allegory of modern times. The Black Plague of the Middle Ages mirrors the increasing threat of nuclear war. This is still a fear today, but in the 1950s when the film was made, tensions were heightened due to the Cold War. Bergman has said of this, quote, "In my film, the Crusader returns from the Crusades as the soldier returns from the war today. In the Middle Ages, man lived in the terror of the plague. Today, we live in fear of the atomic bomb." Unquote. The Seventh Seal takes place in a distant past, during a different crisis, an epidemic that threatened all of Europe. The Black Plague, by some estimates, killed about 1/3 of the population of the continent. Bergman's use of a separate fear in history of the end of the world is a pretext for the director to broach the subject of a contemporary problem. In the 1950s, the consequences of World War II, the loss of life in combat, the Holocaust, the onset of the atomic age, destroyed cities, and economic issues were still part of the landscape. This was not history, this was life, and life had come to feel, well, apocalyptic. This is why the apocalypse, the end of the world, is so often mentioned in the Seventh Seal, and why the film is even called that, a reference to the biblical end times. When the townspeople and the squire talk of omens of disaster, it has meaning even for modern times.
Hästar hade ätit varandra under natten. På kyrkogården hade gravarna öppnats. De dödas lämningar låg kastade över platsen. Det var 4 solar på himlavallet igår eftermiddag.
A common misunderstanding about disbelief in God and the afterlife centers around the idea that life is worthless without a creator and somewhere to go after we die. But limits on our mortality do not take away from the pleasures of life itself, nor does the fact that, even though we may not be made in divine image, that does not take away from the specialness of our existence. To make this point, the director gave us a scene in which Antonius is happy. He is not performing any great feat or defeating death in chess or anything like that. He is sharing a meal with new friends. It has noticeable Eucharistic overtones. He practically blesses the meal, saying, "I shan't forget this moment, and this shall be to me a sign and a great sufficiency." What this means, from a certain perspective anyway, is that Antonius has found his meaning. What theistic human beings call God, that is, the meaning in their lives, others would simply call meaning. His religion is the natural world now. His ritual is not manufactured by human hands, but found in nature. His flock is any human being he comes in contact with. He has found purpose, not divinely handed down as fate. Antonius finds his religion, a fellowship of mankind in the natural world. And for many, that is more than enough. Thanks for watching.